All right, guys. So this next conversation, we'd planned to have this when y'all came back from break, since you were working on your logos. A lot of students seem to have or not be confident with pairing type. I know you guys have typography basics, kerning, leading, tracking, all that fun stuff. But I really wanted to dive in on what you need to look for, what you need to be conscious of when pairing type, because using and pairing typefaces can be a little tricky if you're not familiar with what to look for. Um, so let's go ahead and jump on in. When you think about fonts like people. They have different characteristics based on what style they are. Just like people, we have different characteristics based on our background. Because of these characteristics, I like to think that fonts have personalities. And when you look at these personalities, you can figure out what typefaces pair well with others based on those visual traits, those visual personalities. So when you go to choose a font, really think about what will it be used for. Is this for a header? Is this for body copy, like my paragraph text, my main text that I'm going to use? What is this for? Think about who will be reading it. You need to think about legibility. You wouldn't take a font that's super decorative and involved and make it really tiny if your target audience is an older demographic, like folks in their 60s or 70s, because it might be a little hard to read for them. And also really think about, will it be used in print or on screen? Because that makes a huge difference too. Some fonts view very well on screen, and some of them view better just for print only. So it's really important to know, what are best practices for both of those environments. So when you think of Oh, there we go. So when you think of fonts, again, these font personalities, right? Especially if you're creating a logo like you guys are, really think about, what is the personality? So I'm not going to go over every bit of this chart. You guys can look at that on your own because you will have this PowerPoint as well. Really think about what those fonts um, the vibe that they exude. If you think of something feminine or luxurious, we oftentimes think of these very like grand serif fonts are associated with luxury. This font, for example, could easily be associated with a fancy hotel or a luxury clothing brand, right? Really think about what you're using typefaces for. This one might look really nice if we're featuring maybe the bride and groom's name on a wedding invitation. This type of script you don't want to use a ton of. Like you would not want to read a paragraph of this because you would lose your mind trying to read it because this is so intricate. So you really want to pay attention. Legibility is a huge, huge factor. Something like this guy down here is a little bit more decorative, but you could maybe use it, maybe a header on a menu, like for a Mexican restaurant or something. Maybe if you use it just as a header and sparingly, that could work. Or maybe even just like in a logo for something that's super stylized. Think about just those good go-to typefaces, right? Like the boy or girl next door. You really want to think of typefaces like this. Avenir, very clean serif font. Could easily go modern, contemporary, playful, either way, but this is one that's going to work and pair well with a lot of different things because it's a little neutral as far as shapes. It's very clean, it's very simple. And then think of your simple serifs, right? So sans serif, remember, sans serif does not have a tail, right? And serifs are these little strokes. So remember when we say serif or sans serif, be sure that you're committing that to memory. You should have learned that before you got to me, but just make sure that you're thinking of the characteristics of these typefaces. So moving on, sans serifs, again, fonts like Helvetica, those are considered cleaner, more modern, contemporary. And serif fonts, for example, Times New Roman is a good one. are considered more formal and traditional. Script fonts, that brush lettering that we looked at, the cursive, the wedding-y type fonts, those are display fonts, and those are usually more formal, but they should also be used sparingly just because if you use it too much, it's going to be really hard to read. And again, display fonts, any decorative font, for example, High Noon, the Western font, you guys probably already know. Those should be used strategically and sparingly too, because if they're used too much, it gets a little cheesy, but it definitely gets hard to read. So again, moving forward here, looking at what we just talked about, which one of these would you want to read more of if you had multiple lines of text? Probably one of these two, right? So when you're talking about paragraph text, like think about textbooks, think about novels that you read. Most of them are usually in a serif font that's fairly easy to read, right? Something like this, very busy, only want to use sparingly, and same thing with the sky, okay? So when we talk about pairing fonts, what are the tips? Like if you walk away with just a bare minimum from this talk, what are the tips for pairing type? You want to focus on visual contrast. You want to pair fonts based on their styles, something more traditional paired with something more modern. I've got some examples I'll show you guys in a few minutes. And you want the fonts to be different enough that each stand out, but similar enough that they pair well together and they're easy on the eye. So again, look at these combinations, you guys. So if we take a look, so these are all fonts. I'll share with you some resources later for pairing fonts, but if we take a look at this Budapest, right, and contrast with this sans serif, this one has more visual weight because it's thicker. It also has, if you look real closely, those thin and thicknesses of strokes. So it's got the visual contrast within the font itself. And then if we look at the modern number 20, it's very geometric and it's very symmetrical. So because we have the variation and the contrast up here within this font itself, it's going to pair well because this is a good contrast, a good breathing room, if you will, when we pair those together. And take a look at the other ones as well. You can really see, if you sit and study the shapes, you can see and understand why they pair well together. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these because you guys will have access to this, but this one's really nice because it shows you what this looks like when you're creating that visual hierarchy on a page. So maybe we're creating page layout. Maybe we're creating a newsletter, right? Heading 1, heading 2, paragraph text. This shows me what that's going to look like when I pair them together. So it shows you kind of how, not only what the fonts look like together, but how to pair them together. And I think it's really important to understand how to pair fonts together. It makes you more comfortable with using and experimenting with different types of typefaces. So again, a couple of things pulling from those typography lessons that you guys had whenever you had typography. One thing you need to be really conscious of typographically as far as the anatomy of a font is, whoops, sorry guys, is the X height, okay? So the X height, just to give you guys a little background, a little refresher, is a font is actually measured based on the height of the lowercase x. So whatever that height is, the X height can make a font appear taller or larger based on the height of the lowercase x. So for example, fonts with a larger X height will naturally appear larger. So a lot of people will say, 12 or 11 is usually the default minimum font size. Well, that could change depending on your X height. If your font naturally looks a little bigger, you could probably go down a little bit smaller with that if you needed to. So that's something when you're choosing, especially for legibility, maybe you're trying to fit a lot of content on the page, but you want a font that can scale fairly low. Look for those fonts that have the larger X height. Hierarchy. So we're going to stop. I'm going to pause this one here. I'm going to break this up into chunks, and we'll come back and talk about hierarchy. Okay?